All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. So we are continuing our discussion on bacteria and archaea and sort of talking about how prokaryotes are classified and organized. So at this point, we've talked about structure, we've talked about genetics. Let's talk about the way that they obtain nutrients and energy. So prokaryotes can be categorized both by where their energy source comes from and then where their major mode of nutrition comes from, usually in the form of carbon. So when we look at energy, we talk about either phototrophs versus chemotrophs. So are they using energy from the sun or other light sources in order to gain that energy to do their metabolism? Or is the energy coming from a chemical source? And then we talk about carbon sources. So are they autotrophs versus heterotrophs? And then we look at autotrophs being things that are more akin to things like photosynthesis, where they are using carbon dioxide as their major source of carbon to then be able to build all of the macromolecules that they need. Or are they heterotrophs where they have to take in that organic nutrients already in the form of organic compounds? So they're taking in sugars, they're taking in amino acids from their environment in order to have those building materials as a way to uh, perpetuate their metabolism. So when we use this, we can talk about basically four major modes of nutrition. If they're autotrophs, they can be photoautotrophs, so they're using the carbon dioxide, but the light is their energy source, so they're photosynthetic. All right, things like cyanobacteria, plants would also fall into that category as well outside of bacteria. Or are they chemoautotrophs, where that carbon dioxide is still their carbon source, but they're using other inorganic chemicals as a way to have some energy? So um, sulfurs, methanes, that kind of thing might be energy sources that they're using. So these are guys that we often talk about around things like hydrothermal vents. So there's no sunlight down there. They're not going to be capable of evolving that method, and yet there's a huge amount of um, ecosystem diversity at those depths because these chemoautotrophs are there as a foundation, as a primary producer for those environments. Go to the heterotrophs, and most of you are thinking of things like chemoheterotrophs, where their energy source is coming from the food that they eat as well as their carbon source. We are chemoheterotrophs, okay? And many prokaryotes also fall into that example, things like Clostridium, for example. Those three modes of nutrition most students at this point are aware of and are used to coming across. The unusual one here um, are these things called photoheterotrophs, where they're using light as an energy source, but their carbon source is still coming from things um, like sugars. So there's a handful of bacterial species that fall into those. We're not going to get too in depth with them. The other three are the big ones that you should be aware of at this point, but just be aware that there is that fourth category that does exist for these guys. And it's sort of unusual compared to what we look at with most organism students are aware of. The other thing is their metabolic relationship to oxygen. Do they need it? Will it kill them? Or can they use it if it's present? And this comes down to their ability to produce cellular respiration, to do cellular respiration, as opposed to fermentation, and do they have the ability to do both? So if we're talking about obligate aerobes, we would be classified as an obligate aerobe organism because we require oxygen to do cellular respiration. You deprive us of that oxygen, and our cells will die within a few minutes. We can't sustain the ability to do cellular respiration or produce ATP for any real length of time without the oxygen present. Obligate anaerobes are on the opposite end of that spectrum, where the only thing that they can do is aerobic respiration, they do fermentation, and in the presence of oxygen, things that oxygen um, can produce is actually toxic to them. And so they will only grow where they are depleted of oxygen, at least to a certain level. Your facultative anaerobes sit here in the middle. And on some level, our muscle cells kind of fall into that category, at least for short stints. Um, these are organisms that are going to be able to make ATP via aerobic respiration, cellular respiration, when oxygen is present. And they're going to want to use that because they get a lot more energy out of doing aerobic respiration for the amount of nutrients they take in. And so it's much more efficient. So the oxygen's present, they want to use it. They've evolved the capacity to do it. But when they end up in anaerobic conditions, it's not going to kill them because they are capable of switching over to fermentation, at least for some period of time, until they can restore that oxygen. Your muscle cells do this for short stints. They'd prefer the aerobic respiration. They prefer cellular respiration. They make way more energy out of it. But at least for short bursts, your muscle cells can switch over to lactic acid fermentation and still produce you some energy for a short period of time under those aerobic conditions. Now you get that lactic acid buildup in your muscles and you get that burning sensation. So it's only temporary relief in, say, high stress, fight or flight sorts of situations. Your muscles will do that. And we've evolved that for that reason. But it's not going to be sustainable long term. And for most facultative anaerobes, that would be the case. They would need eventually to return to that oxygen rich environment in order to switch back to cellular respiration and survive. When we look at this from a bacterial standpoint and we culture these guys in a culture tube, we can actually see where they fall out in a almost like a density spectrum. Your obligate anaerobes will only be able to grow at the top of that media where they have oxygen access. Your obligate anaerobes will bury themselves at the very bottom of the tube where they are as far away from that oxygen as possible. And your facultative anaerobes will actually grow through the entire culture media because they can kind of do both. So it really doesn't matter. They just kind of grow where they're at, which is kind of cool to see. Nitrogen metabolism, this is something that certain bacteria can do. This is, if you remember back to ecology and we talked about the nitrogen cycle, the vast majority of the organisms involved in that cycle are prokaryotes because they are capable of doing nitrogen fixation. They are the only organisms that are capable of fixing nitrogen out of the atmosphere in that atmospheric nitrogen compound and fixing it, turning it into amino acids and other organic molecules that everything else on Earth needs. So a lot of these guys will live in those mycorrhizae in the plant roots, right? That sort of associated symbiotic relationship, mutualistic relationship, where they hang out in those plant roots. The plants kind of give them things that they need to survive, and on the flip side, they fix the nitrogen in from the atmosphere into the soil. So now that they can pass those amino acids and things on to those plants, we then eat the plants, get those amino acids, and it goes up the food chain that way. There is instances of metabolic cooperation between prokaryotes. So organisms that live in colonies may on occasion take on specialized roles. This we think might be some indicators, some precursors to multicellular organisms, and perhaps a glimpse into how those multicellular, organisms could have evolved. So these guys will work in colonies and actually diversify and split up the metabolic necessities for the colony as a whole. So something like the cyanobacteria that are existing here, most of them will exist in these long filament colonies And most of them will be photosynthetic cells, meaning they're going through photosynthesis, taking in that carbon, producing the sugars. But you will get these handful of what we call heterocysts. So these are, again, cyanobacteria cells. But what they have done is that they have said, okay, you guys all do that photosynthesis, but we're going to just take on the process of fixing that nitrogen, um, and then sharing out that the amino acids and things that they produce as a result of that nitrogen fixation to the rest of the colony. The photosynthetic cells share the materials back to those heterocysts as a way to allow some flexibility. Not every cell has to do every process. And this is just one example of that. It's more efficient, right? Just think about it. If you had to do every job in our economy yourself, you'd never get it all done in order to survive on the day-to-day basis. So what do? Well, everybody in the community has a job to do to hopefully keep the community moving forward. And that's kind of what's happening here. We've got these specialized cells that take on particular roles, and then they share the materials with the rest of the colony. That being said, these guys end up by themselves off in wherever, and they can retain the ability to do all of those jobs that they need to. Biofilms are another sort of metabolic cooperation colony setup. These guys tend to coat a bunch of surfaces and again may split up metabolic processes amongst certain cells in the colony in order to be more efficient. The biofilm you are probably most closely associated with, know well, even if you didn't know it was a biofilm. If you ever wake up in the morning and you sort of run your tongue across your teeth and it feels a little fuzzy, that's a biofilm. It's bacteria growing on your teeth. You don't take care of it, and it will eventually turn into that dental plaque, which is here. You go to the dentist and they got to scrape hard at your teeth because it's sort of hardened and really set itself up. We get biofilms across all sorts of things. They grow on surfaces really well, becomes a problem oftentimes in medical equipment. Catheters in particular tend to be ones that people who are constantly on catheters for whatever their process is, their medical condition is, can form these biofilms on those catheters and end up with urinary tract infections and all kinds of stuff as a result too.